Suppressing our inner cries for help does not stop our stress hormones from mobilizing the body, writes Bessel Kolk in his now famous work, The Body Keeps the Score, when he's writing about trauma before it was even a thing that people talked about. Now, here's the thing about trauma. It's often misunderstood still, and therefore never resolved. So oftentimes in our lives, we can keep having these stress responses that honestly are a little bit connected to other sources, and we justify from other sources like a hectic schedule, a project at work, a couple rough nights of sleep. And what happens is that we never actually address effectively. And today I want to help you identify what trauma really is. It's often not what we think, how it actually interrupts our well being, and most importantly, how to integrate it back into our story so it doesn't define our story or take nasty control of our current relationships. Now, I have been working with people that have experienced significant trauma for over a decade, but I've been working directly to resolve people's trauma for the last 6 of those years now as a licensed and trained trauma therapist. And let me tell you, the world can be a cruel place. Evil is real. Brokenness sucks. But, and I say this even louder than what I just said, resolving trauma is possible, and it is so redemptive to watch in real time. I remember one of my clients, a girl who had lost so much between complex sexual and physical abuse at different stages in her life. She even lost a baby she was carrying after an attack by her abuser. I mean, it was so heavy and so sad. And yet, I think that's probably why it's one of those most beautiful stories of healing work that I've gotten to witness and be a part of. One of the top for sure. In the months we got to work together, she very courageously took back control of her trauma triggers. She grieved her losses, and she ended up going from self-harm and hatred and confusion, even in her decision making, to becoming actually self-confident and building her resources, and building a life with constructive responses. She was able to think about and talk about her abuse, call it evil, but no longer feel her nervous system activating as if she were unsafe anymore. And here's what I've learned from working over 5,000 individual sessions with clients at this point. We often get trauma. So what is trauma? Well, oftentimes we define it as what happens to you. Domestic violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, natural disasters, environmental neglect, food or housing insecurity, war, violence, and on and on. All of these examples are what happens to a person. And yes, they are hard and can be incredibly scary and overwhelming. But these by themselves, get this, are not what makes trauma trauma. In reality, what makes an event or a series of experiences traumatic is less about what happens to you and more about what happens in you. In other words, in response to something your brain and your body sense danger and then get stuck somewhere in the cycle of sensing and responding to danger. So if you go up into fight or flight or down into freeze or flop, or have learned to fawn and try and just end the cycle of abuse as quickly as possible. Yes, all 5 of those are trauma responses. Whatever you tend to do as your response is a place where we get stuck and a pattern we keep repeating. You see, trauma is whatever overwhelms you enough to get stuck in any one of those cycles. Here's the crazy part. It doesn't even have to be what some people call capital T traumas, your physical or sexual abuse, experiencing war, community violence, domestic violence, or the like. It can be something quote unquote trivial, and I put that heavily in air quotes, to someone else that registers in your brain and your body as traumatic. Why? Because you get stuck in one of these 5 cycles: fight or flight or freeze or fawn or flop. Think of it this way. There can be 2 siblings moving from New York City to Los Angeles. Let's say mom or dad has a job change and they need to make the cross-country move. Well, this family, same culture, same home environment, gets to their new home, and the older sibling has a really, really hard time making friends. Has a really, really hard time fitting in, has a really, really hard time, and ends up crying every night, ends up being really, really anxious about new experiences, and decides, I don't even really want to participate in anything. I'd rather just stay in my bed and sleep. Whereas the younger sibling from the same family culture, same environment, same experience moving from New York to LA, ends up making friends, ends up having a great time at school, experiencing academic success, joins a team, some extracurriculars, and is totally involved in the church. Now, what happened here? For one, it was traumatic. For the other, it was quote unquote trivial. Because it's not what happened to them. The same thing happened to them. They moved across the country. Rather, it's what happened in them. One had greater social resources, maybe some opportunities, whereas the other one had a different mentality and different resources. And that trauma, what happened on the inside, turned into a cycle that kept, in this case, the older sibling stuck. In other words, the same external event can be trivial to one person, but traumatic for the next person. I've learned that it is less about what happens to you and more what happens in you. So how does trauma interrupt our well-being? Well, I've learned that it really interrupts us in 3 different ways. Now, the first 2, I heard of these from Adam Young. He's a podcaster and a counselor, I believe out in Colorado at this point. And the third one I realized also is true. So the first is this: it interrupts us vertically. Here's what happens in the brain when we experience something traumatic. Let me speak in generalities. They are accurate, but it's a little bit more oversimplified, but just for the sake of us understanding what happens in our brain. So vertically, on the top and front part of our brain, we have our executive functionings. That's kind of fancy in flower language for our ability to think critically, our ability to look at the pros and the cons of a situation, our ability to even make an informed decision about something, curious about the world, and engage with others. That's the top part of our brain. The lower part of our brain is where our emotional system lives and does its work, often known as the limbic system. And so what happens when we experience trauma is that the top part, the executive functions, the rational thinking through, hey, let's engage with the world, and the lower part, the emotional regulation system of our brain, get disconnected. So effectively in life, when we have a trauma trigger, meaning when our brain or our body senses, not necessarily accurately, but when we sense something is unsafe or dangerous or as a threat, the emotional system goes on red alert. And it's separated from the top part, our brain. So our ability to rationally think through, is this safe or is this not? Is this person good or is this person dangerous? Is the situation in general, given the context and the circumstances, safe? That's all out the window. Why? Because our emotional system has been triggered and is on red alert. Well, that can cause all kinds of interruptions in our functioning, vertically in our brain. Here's a second way that trauma interrupts our brain and our functioning, and that's horizontally. Again, I'm going to simplify, though it is accurate, it's a little bit simple for the sake of our purposes. So on generally the left hemisphere of our brain, this is where language and logic are controlled. When we are speaking, when we are reasoning, when we are using our logic and we're making those rational connections, the left hemisphere of our brain lights up. Now, there are other parts of the brain that light up as well, but generally, dominantly, it's mostly the left part. Whereas on the right hemisphere, this is where more of our senses do their work and their processing. So this is why art, music, creativity lights up the right hemisphere of the brain, but also our relational information lights up that part of the brain. So our sense of attachment, our sense of connection, our sense of identity, our sense of safety and belonging, all are on the right hemisphere of the brain. And so what happens when we experience trauma? Again, not something that happens to us, but something that happens in us. Well, it interrupts the communication between our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere. This is why sometimes after traumatic experiences in someone's life, you don't really have the language or you can't remember all of it. This is why, in fact, For all intents and purposes, you've forgotten about it. You're like, life is good, it's just fine. And then all of a sudden, you hear a tone of voice, or you see a type of truck. Or once I heard this story about a boy who, every time he smelled buttered popcorn, inexplicably, he would get tense and have a trauma trigger until he realized his abuser would always put in buttered popcorn to the microwave before the abuse would start. So there's this disconnect between our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere. And that, again, can get in the way of our relationships, can get in the way of our decision making, can get in the way of how we interpret the world and how we move and navigate the world. That's a big deal. But here's a third way that trauma interrupts our well-being. We talked about vertically, we've talked about horizontally, but there's also a reality that it interrupts us chronologically. In other words, when we've experienced something traumatic, oftentimes we have this sense of before and after. Like there's this watershed moment in our life. And it makes sense because trauma overwhelms our coping mechanisms. It overwhelms, it's too scary, it's too much, it's too soon. And it overwhelms our ability to cope like we would be able to otherwise, which is why we get stuck in certain cycles. And so it feels like there's something that's stuck at that watershed moment, either when the abuse happened or when the abuse started, if it's chronic and ongoing. And of course, this disconnects us from our own sense of story. This disconnects us from our own sense of identity, because we can think there's a me before and there's a me after, and gosh, maybe I'll never be the same. But I have some really good news for those whose lives have been interrupted by trauma. Again, not necessarily something big. Maybe it was something for you that categorically is considered by all to be traumatic. But even if it wasn't, even if it was just a little comment by mom, or that look that your uncle gave you, or that disappointing moment in school, and it deeply marked you and it kept you stuck in a cycle for a long time. Again, that's something that happens in you and that's equally traumatic. Then here's some really good news, because here are the ways that we integrate trauma into our story so that it doesn't define our story. Okay, and let me say this to start. The goal is never to get to the point where we're saying what happened was good. No. Trauma is evil. Abuse is evil. Even the ways that people hurt us is wrong. And so when we're integrating it, we're not justifying it. We're not beautifying it or saying that it's okay. We're just saying that thing happened, but it no longer is the thing that defines my story. So the first way we want to integrate our trauma into our story and take back control of our lives is vertically. And through guided experience, even being able to write certain things down at the same time that we are regulating in real time how triggered we are. I do this with my clients all the time. And what we're able to do is we're able to, little by little, piece by piece, put back together the executive functioning and the emotional system. And we're able to reintegrate them so that over time, our ability to perceive the world around us, even accurately sense danger or safety, grows and more accurately reflects reality around us. The second thing that we want to do is we want to reconnect language with some of those senses. And again, this is done through talking. This is done through regulated, real-time interaction with someone who is helping you stay calm. But what we want to do is we want to connect both the language with the sense of the traumatic event so that we are taking back control. It's not the thing that defines us anymore. It was terrible. It was unsafe. It was dangerous. It was evil. It was traumatic. But it's no longer our reality now. And what we're able to do is we're able to make sense of what happened. And as we do, here's the magic. We take back control of the thing that had so much control over us and was getting in the way of our lives and our relationships before. Here's the last thing we want to do is we want to reattach the before and the after. We want to connect and integrate our story chronologically so that we're able to say, yes, that thing was terrible. That thing is part of my story, but it's not the thing that defines my sense of identity, my sense of accomplishment, my sense of purpose or value or dignity. It's not the thing that defines my story. Now, there are particular exercises that I take my coaching and more therapy clients through in order to reconnect the before and after and get a sense of a chronological story in the life of somebody. I get to do this all the time. I get to see the beauty of redemption. I get to see the beauty of being able to connect the before and after into a coherent and integrated you who, yes, has experienced hard things, but has now come out on the other side and is stronger and resilient and more able to empathize with others and has a fuller soul because you were so resilient and lived through those hard things. That's the beauty of the work that I get to do. And that's the hope that I want you to know is possible. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, I want you to put in the comments where you feel stuck. You don't have to overshare, but what's the cycle that you find yourself repeating? I read each of those, and I would love to be able to help you get unstuck. In fact, one of the best ways to do this is to join me in an emotional breakthrough boot camp where we take 1 hour over 3 days to actually begin to recognize where we've gotten stuck, figure out why we're stuck there, and create a coherent roadmap for getting unstuck and living your best life, emotionally free and fully alive. So I want you to go to emotionalbreakthroughbootcamp.com. We have all the details of our next one there, emotionalbreakthroughbootcamp.com. And I want to encourage you to be a VIP member. That way we can actually have live question and answers and work one-on-one together. But either way, friend, know that God is redemptive. God is greater than your trauma. God is a God of story, and he is able to bring redemptive things into your life. So God is good. You got this, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.